All right, everyone, today we are going to jump forward a little bit in history. So the past couple classes, you've been looking at some ancient history with the Crusades and medical advancement and the Spanish Inquisition. And we're going to start moving forward to more modern history and the modern conflicts in the Middle East. So today you're getting a lecture on the Mandate period, which you'll learn all about in a few minutes. And then you'll have a little activity today. In the next class, you're going to have some more activities that will build on your understanding of the Mandate period. It's important you understand this time period before we move on to any other concepts in the Middle East and then eventually modern issues that are happening. So, Mandate period is 1920 to 1948. Hopefully you know what that time period was like. So to start with, even though the Mandate period starts in 1920, it is a result of World War I. So what's happening in World War I? Hopefully most of you remember that from world history. And a lot of what happens in the Middle East will be a direct result of the major country that was basically running the world at that point, which was Great Britain. Very good. Remember, owned a quarter of the world, and was very good at imperialism and taking over other areas. So during World War I, Britain is on the side of the what will become the Allies, and you'll see them really pushing for all the smaller countries that are supporting Germany and Austria at that time to basically have their own internal conflict. It was a big thing in Britain throughout all of its history to get people to fight each other so they didn't have to do it themselves. So they're going to start with joining forces with the Arab population over in Israel area to push the Turks, which was the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, to push them out of Palestine. You'll see we have clear records of this. We have the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, which is the basic agreement that if they fight against the Turks, and when the British help push them out, then Britain will agree that the Arabs own Palestine. The exact same thing that was done in the Zimmerman telegram with Germany and Mexico, except Mexico didn't accept. The Palestinians did accept. Unfortunately, they didn't know much about Britain's history because as soon as they win, Britain does not follow through with that agreement. Instead, they joined forces with France to stabilize the area, meaning take over and control the area. And you'll see them creating the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which means now that they have control of the area, once World War I is done, they're just going to split Palestine between them, which France apparently didn't pay attention to Britain's track record, because Britain, again, will not split that with France. They're just going to maintain their own control. You'll also see Britain supporting the Zionism movement. Okay. So this is based off the Balfour Declaration. The Zionistic movement is the idea that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish population. This push to move the Jews out of Europe and other places around the world back to this one area, which, if you remember from studying our religion unit, that Palestine does have huge, very long-standing markers for religious holy lands, but it's recognized by all three of the major monotheistic religions. You'll see them supporting this movement because it's going to give them a power over that population and create an internal conflict that doesn't really affect them but keeps the area unstable so that they can maintain control. So when the war ends, Britain holds on to Palestine and the surrounding areas, not just because they want to, but because they've been given a mandate, which is an order you have to follow. a mandate from the League of Nations that they need to stay and help protect the area. Now remember, Britain at that time is very much in charge and is basically running the League of Nations, so they're using it to gain power over the area. Yeah. So initially what will happen is Britain will monitor the area through an occupied enemy territory administration, meaning they are going to have basically a panel of people who come in and decide how things are going to do. This panel is military, so you will have military forces in Palestine that are British. It will be replaced in 1920, okay, after the war has ended, everything is settled, by a civil administration with a Zionist leader. So you're going to have some divide right there, starting from the very beginning. And the government itself is going to appear to favor Zionism, the idea of making Israel a Jewish territory. There's two major leaders at that time. Penis Rutenberg represents the Zionistic population, and Amin al-Husseini represents the Arab population of Palestine. Big conflicts between the two of them over who actually should have this homeland, the people who are coming in or the people who have lived there. Yeah. So the result of that is obviously something we would expect. You're going to have a revolt. It'll be called the Arab Revolt. It will last from 1936 to 1939. There's going to be a movement called the Black Hand, which is this anti-Zionistic movement. If you go to Google it to learn more about it, you do have to be specific because Black Hand is actually used by a bunch of different groups for some reason, including like some weird mafia group out of Italy. But so you want to make sure you're looking at the anti-Zionistic movement. They're responsible for bombings and vandalism. They were led by Izz al-Din al-Qasim, who was killed in 1935, so right before the Arab revolt. So you can imagine having a basically like a terrorist group fighting, and then their leader who was holding them together dies. That's when you wind up with a full revolt. It begins with Arab strike and destruction of Jewish farms, okay, out in the countryside, and then you'll see the violence breaking out in Palestine itself. Then by 1939, because of the British influence and their fighting back in the revolt, about 10%, which is a huge number, 10% of the male Arab population will have been killed, imprisoned, or exiled, forced to leave the country and not allowed to return. Okay. So the big effect that will come from this, okay, is you'll start to see the development of Jewish militias. So if you remember anything from American history, a militia is voluntary citizens joining together to train and basically act as a military. And you're doing it, and it's just organized by the people. It's not a government-sanctioned military, but it's allowed to exist. And that's when you start to see suggestions coming up about making a partition between Jews and Arabs, a division. At the same time, there's also massive tension because of the White Paper of 1939, which was a decision by the British to reduce Jewish immigration. And they're going to say it's meant to lessen the conflict, lessen the tension of the area by preventing more people from moving in and causing a greater rift, which is understandable, except it's 1939. So what's going to happen in 1939? That's right, World War II is going to happen, and you're going to have the Jewish population targeted in most of Europe by the Nazi Party. So World War II is going to start. Italy is going to be the one who's going to be attacking northern Africa and the Middle East. So you're going to see bombings from the Italians. There's a period called the 200 Days of Dread because you just didn't know if you're going to live or die or who was going to invade. The Arab military population is encouraged by the Nazi Party, so they're going to take a page out of Britain's handbook on how to get people to do what they want. Same deal. You fight internally, you fight the British, and you will be rewarded with your own country when this is all over. A lot of people look at that and say, well, the Nazis were interested because of the whole Holocaust movement and trying to eliminate the Jews. But in reality, if you look at it from a strategic point, their motivation was far more about causing conflict within the area and distracting Britain as one of their major areas that they needed to maintain control over. If there's fighting there, then they have less effort to fight the actual Nazis. So what's interesting is during all of this, even after we recognize the Holocaust is happening, you do see Britain continue to ban Jewish immigration past 15,000 people. They set up a quota, 15,000 each year, even though we know 6 million will be killed. And so you see thousands of Jews trying to escape Europe to Palestine. We also are more than well aware that they tried to escape to America, but on each shore they meet the same thing, which is refusal. Not allowed to enter the country. You additionally see several ships that are just filled with refugees being bombed by Britain and Soviet submarines. And that ban will continue to be held after World War II, which was another major issue, again, not just in Palestine, but in America as well. Because after World War II ends, the surviving Jewish population, you have about 250,000 people who had been displaced, meaning their homes were gone. They had nowhere to go. And they had family that had escaped to other areas, including Palestine, but they weren't allowed to come in unless they were within that 15,000 quota. Okay, so obviously terrible time period, and following it, you're going to see basically a civil war develop in Palestine. So a civil war, when it starts, is called a civil war. Okay, it's 1947 to 1948. And you'll see a Jewish resistance movement, and they're going to start bombing British buildings because they're starting to recognize it's the British that are actually causing the majority of the problems, particularly by keeping that quota so low and not allowing their family members safe entry. The British response is that they're going to occupy Palestine again, with over 100,000 troops. And what's going to be interesting is they're actually going to request to terminate the mandate. So at this point, the United Nations had replaced the League of Nations, and Britain was no longer in charge of anything. And they basically want to say, we don't want to be in charge of this country where we've ruined everything, and it's just a whole mess that we would just like to walk away from. They're going to add that up with the Transjordan Memorandum, saying, all right, well, we'll try and fix it. We're just going to split it. And we'll say this area is Palestine and this area is Israel. They will do that with, I won't say no influence or interest. I will say more like lip service, where they will ask the leaders of those areas for their opinion, but it's strictly Britain. Britain is deciding how they're going to divide this area, just like they did with most of the Middle East, and which is why you see many nations that identify differently from the state they're in because of how Britain divided the land. So you'll see a civil war break out because of that, in terms of this was our land, why is it theirs now, or this was their land. And it's just this whole argument based on what categories have been given to them. And again, Britain's really going to push to cause more problems. There's no other way of saying it. They're going to be involved on both sides. So Britain will support the Palestine movement, and they'll support the Israel movement. And they're doing that to take focus off of the fact that they are the ones that caused the problem by creating those borders in the first place. And while the conflict starts to ramp up between the two groups, Britain will slowly remove itself from Palestine. So when the mandate ends, okay, Britain no longer is responsible for the mess they created, and Israel is officially established. And then that's where it gets interesting. They're going to relabel the war as the Arab-Israeli War, which is important to note because when you take the term like civil war in Palestine, you're giving credence to that the area is Palestine and it's fighting between the two internal groups. When you change it to Arab-Israeli War, you're now shifting it to the two groups, and guess who's missing? Britain. Okay, they've tried to erase themselves from the history. Okay. So that's just a brief covering of the area. Very more in depth. That's why we're going to do a couple of days with a couple of different activities on this period. But for today, and we're going to keep it real simple because I did give you the lecture for it. You are just going to get a map. I only have a PDF of it, and it's a scan of a PDF, so I can't get it to go over to Google Docs. So what I did was I made a Google form for you to answer the questions on. So look at the PDF, answer the questions on the Google form, and you will be all set. And then come back next class and we'll learn even more about this issue. All right, have a good day.